and that will help a lot. Um, Tonight, again, this is our second night to have Eric with us. We did record the first one, and it is up. We will, or I'll send out that link to it soon. Soon. And so if you want to record it, or anybody who wasn't here last week, you get a chance to catch up with last week. And shortly then we'll also have tonight up. And you have Jerry to thank for that. So without further ado, I don't want to read that long introduction unless you want me to, Gary. um, we'll just dig right into Acts and have at it. Dr. Eric Smith.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you all again. I'm kind of looking out the window of my office and remembering that last week it was pouring snow and this week it's 80 degrees. So maybe next week we'll have, fire and brimstone or something, who knows, in Colorado in springtime. But it's good to be with you again. I thought we would start this week just by asking, as sometimes happens, you sit in an hour and a half long thing and you get to the end and you're really tired and you might not have a question, but when you get home and lay down in the bed, you might start thinking of things. And so I thought we might start with just a Q&A after last time and then go into this week's material and then do some more Q&A at the end, if that's okay. And there might not be any questions up front, but I'm just curious whether anything, you know how that goes. I see Carol has unmuted. You have one, Carol?
Oh, indeed, right. I do. And what I said, why didn't I ask you? And that is, how did you get your passion for this subject? What was the catalyst to all of this wonderful study?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I guess maybe it's not the case that everyone shares a deep passion for the book of Acts. I don't know. I feel like everyone should. But for me, I am what they call in the academy a theory head. I really like theory. And so the theories I've been working with lately tend to focus around power and sovereignty, and especially like post-colonial theories of power and sovereignty. I can go into that if you want. In fact, I'll go into it a little bit tonight. But in thinking about, which New Testament texts really work with these questions of power and which ones have the potential to be read in kind of against the grain ways or counter narrative kind of ways, I think Acts really stands out because it's so much about, belonging, and it's so much about violence, and it's so much about, working out of an identity. So to me, it's just a really nice fit with these theoretical things that I've been thinking about. I also just spent a couple of years, really thinking about Paul and Paul's letters. And so I think, really we have two main sources of information for Paul. One is his letters, and I wrote a book on that. And so now I'm working on this book on Acts, sort of from this other standpoint, thinking about power and sovereignty. And I'm the main theorist I'm working with is this person named Akili Mbembe, who's a sub-Saharan African post-colonial theorist. And he points out, a lot of people think in the Eurocentric Western world, people think power is sort of an individualistic thing where it's all about flourishing and, becoming all that you're meant to be and reaching your potential, and, that sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of way of just being everything that you were meant to be. And Mbembe says, not really. That's not really what the case is for most people in most places. For most people in most places, the question is, do you control your body? Do you have power over your own life and death? And I think that's a much more helpful way to read Acts. That's the question that's on the table a lot of the time in the book of Acts. So that's a long answer to your question, but I do find it to be an endlessly fascinating book, and overlooked, I think, in New Testament scholarship. And I guess I would ask back to St. Andrew, like, You just did this Acts study. So what's the prompt for that? What prompted your church to decide this was something to undertake? For those of you who are in that.
Yeah, a lot because we never speak of it.
That's right. And I think when we do speak of it, often we read it as this it's a triumph, right? It's the story of the birth of the church, and it is that, but it's also more complicated than that. Which again, I think I said this last week, to me is really comforting, coming from mainline Protestant traditions that have succeeded in kind of dramatic ways, but also failed in really dramatic ways. And this is a central part of the Methodist story right now, I know, is the success on the one hand and the fractures and the failures on the other hand. And it's true for my traditions that I come from. And I think reading Acts as a more ambivalent text can help us as we navigate some of that.
I think the thing that caught my interest was the beginning of the church. That I'd like to know more about that.
Why?
I don't know. Just because I should. If I'm gonna be a Christian, I should know where I've come from.
Yeah, I agree. I often say if they ever invented a time machine, I would have it drop me off in Ephesus in about the year 50 or 55, I think, because I just want to know, like, where did this all, why did this all start? Yeah.
And how, and you have me thinking in different ways from last week. I'm hoping you won't ask me for an example because I probably couldn't think of one, but I remember thinking, oh, and I like that.
Good. That's great.
I'm kind of curious. Could I ask a question? It seems to me Acts was written at a time of great intellectual ferment. Sometimes we who have been brought up in Christian traditions think that after the temple was destroyed, Judaism kind of fell apart. But that doesn't seem to be true, because the Jews use the word Tanaim for rabbis, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them all over the diaspora working on intellectual, perhaps apologies for the Jewish tradition. And I must say that every time I read Stephen's speech, I think maybe Acts is trying to say, because that, from my point of view, never happened. But from my point of view, is Acts trying to explain or be in dialogue with what those rabbis were writing about Judaism? I mean, it's it wasn't an empty era. It was very active. Can you kind of elucidate or explain any of that?
It's good to hear your voice, Joan. Joan and I hang out a lot in lots of different places, but not lately. So that's a great question. It's a great question because, I think Acts is among the books of the New Testament, the one most concerned with this question. You can see it in the Gospel of John. You can see it in the Gospel of Matthew. You can see it a lot in Paul's letters. But in Acts, the question on the table is, what does it mean to be a Judean or a Jew? In Greek, those words are the same word, a Judaios. What does it mean? And, in a minute, when we start, actually, it's very fortuitous that you bring this up, this Stephen's speech, because that's kind of where we're going to start. That's a speech that's debating the meaning of that identity. What does it mean to belong in this kind of way? And all the way through Acts, they're fighting over this. It's Judeans fighting with Judeans over what it means to be Judean. And it's I think Acts is a little bit, it's unsettled on that question. But as you point out, like, the trajectory moving forward is that these do develop as two distinct religious traditions, intertwined for sure, but they're two distinct traditions that develop forward. And then historically, of course, one becomes far more powerful than the other. Christianity becomes far more powerful, and really, I would argue, very abusive toward Judaism. It's not an equal relationship at all. Christianity has done great harm to Judaism over the years, which has not been, hasn't gone two directions. And I think Acts, bears some responsibility for that as a text that kind of sets that table and makes it possible for later Christian anti-Semitism to flourish. And by the way, I have this little book chapter out where I make the argument, when Christianity learned to do that, when it learned to make others out of Jews and to push Judaism to the side because it could, that's where it learned the thing that it eventually put into practice. When I would argue that maybe Christianity didn't invent racism, but it certainly is co-created, Christianity, modern Christianity and modern racism, as my colleague Ted Bile has argued, are kind of co-created and co-constituted. So I think, when Christianity turned Jews into others, it learned a trick that it did later with other people. And that's in some ways, the dark sort of deep past origins of racism. So all that is to say, yeah, I think Acts is playing with fire in certain kinds of ways, and you can see it in the pages. And the conversation in Acts is still kind of two directional. You still see Jews saying, these Jews saying to these Jews, here's what we think it means to be Jewish. But that conversation doesn't stay two directional for much longer after the book of Acts. And that's a really painful history. In the Society of Biblical Literature, I co-chair a program unit called Early Jewish Christian Relations. And that's sort of what we do. We just ask, what was the relationship between these two groups that we now call religions? And it's a difficult group to be in sometimes, because it's not always, it doesn't always feel good to identify as Christian when you're having those conversations, because we haven't really done the right thing all the time.
Thank you.
That's a roundabout non-answer, but you can see.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, so I'm gonna, I know probably others of you have questions, but I'm gonna take Joan's slow pitch over the plate here, and we'll start with, I'm sorry, George, did you have one?
My interest in Acts is because of a personal interest in history. I'm a history buff, and so I'm very interested in how things began, how they initially started. And I've in reading Acts, I have a book that I've been plowing through called Acts and Christian Beginnings, and it comes from the West Star Institute. You're probably familiar with them. I don't know what you think of the book. Is rather well written, in my opinion. But to me, when I look at Acts, is what is historical fiction and what is historical fact, and how do you tease out the difference for one from the other? If that makes sense.
It does make sense. I do have that book. It's sitting on the table right behind the screen that I'm looking at. And it's a good book. I think it, the West Star, which is the rebranded name of the Jesus Seminar, I think they tend to be skeptical people, right? In terms of historicity, they tend to not put a lot of stock. But in that book, I see them, they're kind of landing in the middle a lot of the time about the historicity of Acts. And I think that's an interesting thing in its own right. And I guess my follow-up question is, what's at stake when we ask about history? What do we want out of a book like Acts when we ask how historical it is? What are we looking for? Because I don't think Acts as a book really, I don't think it's trying to do history in the sense that we would hope, like the New York Times article tomorrow about today's news would do history. That's not what Acts is trying to do. So I'm just wondering, like, what's behind that question for us, right? When we say, what if this is historical?
Well, it's a knowledge of how things began. Mm-hmm. Helps create an understanding of where we are now.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and my own religious tradition is the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and we treat Acts as a charter, for how the church ought to be. We take that that historical question really seriously. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think you're right on that. And so I think it's just worth asking, you know, when we do look for origins like that, what do we want out of them? And just being honest with ourselves, which it sounds like you are. Okay, so I'm going to start then, so we don't spend the whole time just in conversation. But I'm really grateful for your questions, and now you'll know that we'll have more time at the end. So we closed last week looking at chapter 6, and so that's where we're going to pick up. Oh, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. I think I've got a better way to do this time. Let's see, this one. And how was that? That'll look good. Somebody give me a thumbs up if that's what it should be. Great. Okay. Thanks, Jill. So last week we ended in chapter 6, and the beginning chapters of Acts up through that chapter are really, as I was saying, kind of full of community. They're all talking about how these people got along, how they shared stuff, how they prayed all the time. They were in the temple, sort of describing this utopian community, which is actually, you know, going back to what George was just saying, it's part of what I really value about Acts as almost like a charter for the church. You know, it's church as it ought to be. I wish I could go to that church that is described in the early chapters of Acts. In chapter 6 and 7, though, that sort of comes apart a little bit. So we reach in this chapter the story of the martyrdom of Stephen, which is a pretty pivotal point in the book, I think. So in this section of Acts, there's a selection that's done that already kind of presages a conflict, because there's a conflict between where the Hellenists are saying our widows aren't really getting as much support as other widows are. So this sets up a conflict between a group called the Hellenists and a group called the Hebrews that Acts kind of plays with for about 20 chapters. And it's not entirely clear who these groups are, but as we'll see this week and also next week, I think that there's some clues we can kind of look to see who they might be. So as part of solving this problem of the Hellenists, the community picks 7 deacons, which is, by the way, one of the reasons some groups, like, for instance, the Westar Institute that George was just talking about, it's one of the reasons people would point to a 2nd century date for Acts, because church offices like the diaconate might belong more naturally to the 2nd century when there's more church organization than they would to the 1st century when things were still a little bit ad hoc. But so there's this diaconate that's created. One of those is Stephen, and Stephen gets arrested as a consequence of his work. I've put a little Byzantine icon of Stephen up here for you to look at from the 11th century. And so in this episode of Stephen getting arrested, we start to really see what I was talking about with I think Carol or Carolyn, I can't remember, and I can't see you on the screen, but this presence of power and how imperial power kind of weighs down on the text of Acts and on the events behind that text in really powerful ways, and on the lives of people that are depicted in the text. So Stephen gets into this conflict with some people from what's called the Synagogue of the Freedmen, which is otherwise not really known. We don't really know what the Synagogue of the Freedmen was. They've never dug it up or anything like that in Jerusalem. But the name of it and the way it's described kind of suggests that it's a synagogue made up of diaspora Jews. That is, people who are Jewish or Judean ethnically and sort of by heritage, but they were born and maybe grew up in the diaspora, that is outside of Judea and outside of Jerusalem. And so Paul's one of these. Paul's a diaspora Jew. He grows up in Tarsus. And there's lots and lots. There's more Jews living outside of Judea than there are in Judea. And so probably what's happened is a group of these people or a bunch of these people have come back, as you might do, back to the homeland whenever they had an opportunity, and they had their own synagogue. And that's also kind of natural if you think about it. There probably were language differences. If you'd grown up in the diaspora, you probably didn't grow up speaking Aramaic, which the text sometimes calls Hebrew because they're very similar in this period. You probably grew up speaking Greek, or maybe from the far west you might have spoken Latin, and so they seem to have been a synagogue kind of centered on that linguistic difference, but also just that experience of having grown up in the diaspora. And so whoever they are, Stephen's in conflict with these people, and this is kind of a recurring theme throughout Acts, that there's characters in the story who come into conflict with diaspora Jews, and people in the story also come into conflict with Judean Jews, that is, people who are not diaspora Jews. And so sometimes there's these like triangulations of power that are really fascinating. And then of course, over all that, you have the Roman presence, which is a different thing altogether. And one of the things that Stephen kind of gets accused of in this passage is that he is, if you look in 6:13 in the verses I have up on the screen, they say, this man never stops saying things against this holy place and the law. Right. So this is what I mean when I say that they're Judeans arguing with Judeans about what it means to be Judean. And by this holy place, they're probably talking about the temple in particular. And by the law, they mean the Torah. So it's a difference of opinion. As we all know, as sort of religious folks, this is how religions work, is people argue over what it means to belong. And that's what they're doing here. This is kind of the push and the pull of identity, right? That there's a difference of opinion from Jews in the diaspora about what it means to belong, which is natural, but also troublesome. And this also, by the way, makes sense if the book of Acts, as it almost certainly is, was written after the end of the Jewish War. The Jewish War, after the Jewish War, it almost becomes radioactive to identify as a Judean, because these are people who had just rebelled against the empire. They'd just been defeated. They're literally on coins. There's coins going around commemorating their defeat. It's a very perilous identity. And so, following all of that, there is maybe something really powerful about someone accusing Stephen in this text of speaking against the holy place, knowing that the holy place is now destroyed. So here's that theorist I was talking about a minute ago, or actually this is a theorist that theorist uses. This is from Frantz Fanon, who is a North African and a Caribbean writer from the middle of the 20th century. Writes some really fascinating books if you get a chance to look at any of them. And he says about colonial settings, and I argue that Judea was a colonial setting because Rome is this colonial imperial power that has come in and set up camp there. He says about a 20th century colonial setting, whereas the colonist or police officer can beat the colonized subject day in and day out and shove him to his knees, it is not uncommon to see the colonized subject draw his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive look from another colonized subject. So Fanon is kind of describing this thing that happens in colonial settings where there's a vertical power differential. The Romans are oppressing you, but because you can't take down the Romans, you're going to fight with each other. And that's part of the violence of the colonial system. And I think that's partly what explains what's happening here in this part of Acts, is that Stephen is entangled with this group of diaspora Jews over the question of belonging, precisely because none of them could do anything about the Romans. The Romans are just there, and they're going to keep oppressing us. And so we fight with each other about what it means to belong. So Stephen gives this big speech, which Joan has confessed she thinks is ahistorical. And I think actually, for the record, all speeches in Acts are probably ahistorical. That's my opinion. I think they're all composed for the moment by the author of Acts, which is not to say, to us that sounds really dishonest and it sounds duplicitous. And you would get in trouble if you did that in the New York Times. People have gotten in trouble for doing that in the New York Times. But it's normal practice in the ancient world. So I think that's what's happening with the speeches in Acts, because they're all just a little too much like that speech that you get in an argument and you go home and you're laying in bed and you can't sleep, and it's the speech that you come up with in your head later on, right? You all know the one I'm talking about. Here's what I should have said to this person. That's how the speeches in Acts kind of work, I think. And again, that's a normal thing for the first and second century. That's not a problem. It's not some sort of violation of ethics or something on the part of the author. But this speech that Stephen gives if it, it's very poorly suited. If I'm being chased, if I've been arrested and I'm being chased by a mob of angry people, this is not the speech I'm going to give. He gives this speech that's very confrontational. He gives this speech that sort of is about Israel's history. So he's kind of narrating, here's how God has been on our side all through history. But then the second part of it is, and here's how we have not been on God's side. And in particular, here's how you, and he's talking to the people who are about to kill him, here's how you have screwed this up. So I'll read one little passage from it. This is from the very end of the speech. He says, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one. And now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, yet you have not kept it." This is not the speech you give, if you're trying to save yourself from being stoned to death. This is a speech you give, if you want to get stoned to death, or it's the speech that Luke writes for you to show how righteous you were just before you died. So I think that's what's happening here. And immediately after, in 754, if you're following along in the book of Acts, immediately after he gives a speech, they pick up rocks and they stone Stephen to death. And by the way, speaking of diaspora Jews and violence, immediately following that, at the end of chapter 7, the text says, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. And Saul approved of their killing him. So we get kind of this first glimpse of Saul. It's almost like in Star Wars where you hear Darth Vader's music before you really see him, right? This is who we see Paul coming, and he's going to become a major figure later. It's very artful, I think, on the part of Luke to put it this way, because it's a way to introduce Paul, who's here called Saul. We'll get into that in a minute. Without kind of saying, and by the way, he became a really important person. It's kind of an artful way to drop it into the narrative, I think. So continuing on in chapter 8, I think chapter 8 is one of the more fascinating chapters in Acts. For my money, by the way, 8 and 16 are the two headline chapters. We'll look at 8 this week and 16 next week. But in chapter 8, there's this promise fulfilled, I think, in certain kinds of ways. If you remember last week, I said at the very beginning of Acts, there's this promise that you're going to be witnesses to the ends of the earth. And the way it actually goes is you're going to be witnesses in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so the stoning of Stephen is the impetus for all this to start to happen. Maybe ironically, you wouldn't think that someone being martyred is ultimately a good thing, but in terms of the narrative arc of Acts, I think it's what sets things in motion for that promise that Jesus makes at the beginning of Acts to start to be fulfilled. So they end up in Samaria, and there's the story of a man named Simon, and Simon is, I think, a paradigm for a prototype for other figures that you meet in the book of Acts in certain kinds of ways. So Simon is not a musician. Sorry, that's completely wrong. Apologies to the musicians. Simon is a magician. He is a practicer of magic. And so Simon sees Philip preaching and really kind of thinks this is great. It's like a new hustle almost. And actually the text of Acts is a little ambiguous about whether he thinks it's a hustle that he should get in on, or whether he's genuinely compelled by it, or maybe a little bit of both. But what he does is he tries to buy access to the Holy Spirit. And this is a pattern that we're going to see a bunch of times in Acts. We're going to see it with the enslaved girl in chapter 16. We're going to see it with the 7 sons of Sceva. Later on, the silversmiths in Ephesus. There's a bunch of cases in the book of Acts where you have sort of a religious charlatan in the text, someone who is just profiting off of people's piety. And I think my argument in this book I'm working on is I think these are all ways to actually poke at the Jerusalem priesthood, who I think the author of Acts wants to accuse of doing the same thing. But it's to get back to Joan's question earlier. So, but here's the first one we really meet is this magician Simon, and I think it's interesting to read this text in light of our modern notions of religion, because today we have this really tidy line between religion and magic. And we think they're two different things. In the ancient world, really, religion and magic were very closely related and sometimes indistinguishable from each other. So there's all these really fascinating magical texts that get dug up that are, in many ways very Christian. They're calling on Jesus. They're calling on angels and other biblical figures, but they're doing so alongside other deities. Sometimes it's just this like laundry list of figures that they're hoping are going to be powerful enough to meet their request. So, probably for early readers of Acts, this figure Simon would have been recognizable as a border figure, as someone who, could be a Jesus follower in certain kinds of ways, but in other ways not. And for us, it seems really like out of bounds for a magician to be doing this. But I think the lines were a little blurrier in the ancient world. So also in Samaria, we get one of the most fascinating episodes, I think, in all of the book of Acts, and arguably all of the Bible. This is the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. There's so much to say about the Ethiopian eunuch. We're going to, I guess, say some of those things. So the first thing I'll say is that this episode, if you want to flip over to this in your Bible to chapter 8, it's just disconnected from everything. Thinking in terms of narrative flow, it's really unconnected. It's an ill-defined space. The way it's described is sort of nebulous. It's not really clear where they are. It's a wilderness, explicitly a wilderness. And the wilderness that is described as being sort of on a wilderness road is not actually close to Samaria, where this is supposedly taking place anyway. And it's almost like a passage that's kind of set within this larger narrative that the author didn't really know how to do anything with. So the main characters here are Philip and an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. So this is quite the laundry list of identities that are being kind of piled on here. This is quite the list of attributes. So first of all, you have an Ethiopian, which is a figure. Ethiopian identity is complicated. People have written whole books on what is meant by this, but probably what's in view here is the kingdom of Meroe, which is south of Egypt. Ethiopians in kind of the Mediterranean imagination are people who are thought to live on the edge of the world. So here's probably, we're probably supposed to understand that this promise that Jesus makes about the ends of the earth, the ends of the world, that this is being fulfilled because this Ethiopian is hearing it. So he's an outsider. He's from somewhere else. He's a traveler. He seems to be quite important as an Ethiopian. He's a court official in charge of the treasury. So he has a lot of access to wealth, which is shown by the fact that he's in a chariot, which is a very expensive thing. And it's shown by the fact that he has a book of Isaiah, which is even still more expensive, very difficult to come by, very expensive. So he's got lots of money, whether it's his money or Ethiopia's money, it doesn't really matter at this point. And he's come to Jerusalem to worship, which is a really strange thing. It suggests, he might be somehow participating in this diasporic identity that is so important to Acts. Maybe he's a Judean in exile. Maybe he's somehow connected. But he's also a eunuch. And even still more books have been written about what it means that he's a eunuch. A eunuch, in really simple terms, is a man who has been castrated. And it was common in the ancient world to castrate men for service in a royal court for lots of reasons. And so this Ethiopian eunuch becomes sort of again, kind of a middle figure, like a border figure who isn't quite a man and isn't quite not a man, and isn't quite Judean and isn't quite not a Judean. And for modern readers, I'll use the pronoun he because I don't have a better one. They, I guess they is the best pronoun here, are a sort of stand-in for queer identity. You hear that a lot of times. People do a lot of queer readings of the Ethiopian eunuch. So there's just a ton going on. And by the way, if you are a eunuch and you have been castrated, then texts like Deuteronomy 23:1 say that you are not allowed to worship in the temple. So it's complicated. Like, what is this person up to? What is this person doing? And it's clear that the Ethiopian eunuch is very interested in what we would call Judaism, is very interested, very enthusiastic. So I'm just going to read this passage because I think it's short enough and it's worthwhile. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south." And actually the word south there, you see there's a little note. If you have really good eyesight, you can see that. That's even a complicated word. That's kind of a guess that's what that means. To the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza, another little parenthetical thing. This is a wilderness road. So he got up and went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace. And by the way, Candace is not a name, it's a title. The Candace is what they called the queen of Ethiopia, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot, and was reading the prophet Isaiah, which, by the way, suggests a certain level of education, literacy, which would have been unusual. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you understand what you're reading?" He replied, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. Now the passage of the scripture that he was reading, and this is a really interesting citation, was this: like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter, like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. The eunuch asked Philip, "About whom, may I ask, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" Then Philip began to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" And often commentators note, by the way, that it's pretty good luck to come across water enough for baptizing in the middle of the desert. He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down to the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. But Philip found himself in Azotus, and he was passing through the region. He proclaimed the good news to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. So he got sort of teleported out of there. Fascinating story, full of all kinds of stuff. You've got this eunuch who he's super devoted. He's interested in the God of Israel, but also would have been barred for worship. You have high wealth and high status combined with the status as a eunuch. You've got this really person who seems to get what's going on theologically more than almost anyone else we've met so far, but also is an Ethiopian. It's a very, and it happens nowhere, by the way. It happens in this sort of bottle episode that isn't connected to much that comes before or after it. There's a lot of scholarship on this passage that focuses on a couple of different things. One, beginning only in the very late 1980s, people have started to say, what are the implications of the Ethiopian's blackness? What are the implications of his skin? And I put this little quote from Niels Dahl at the bottom, just to kind of show how scholarship has often worked with this, which is to say, it is quite possible he was black, but it is never said. There's this tendency in scholarship to deny the blackness of the Ethiopian, even though Ethiopians were sort of stereotypically very black in the imaginations of people from the Mediterranean region. Next week, I'll show you some other things about the way Africa and Ethiopia gets erased in biblical studies and in the church world that will connect to this. Then there's also this focus, as I already said, on gender and sexuality, which is one of the sort of clearest discussions of gender and sexuality in the New Testament. There's a lot of readings, about how this person would have been denied male roles, but also denied female roles and kind of lived in this middle space without a gender. There's a really great piece by Manuel Villalobos Mendoza that reads this story in light of theories about borderlands and how the eunuch is a border crosser who's pushed away across borders of gender and identity and sexuality, but also geographical borders. And this is put into his own experience of being called a person del otro lado, a person from the other side, a gay person in his native Mexico who had to cross over a border in order to sort of be himself. And then there are other readings of this text that really focus on ambiguities in it. You know, the ways that the Ethiopian eunuch gets all these specific identities attached, but also is in some ways like the least solid identity of anyone we meet, which I think is really interesting. One more thing, those of you who have your Bibles with you, flip over to Acts 8:37 for me. Somebody read me Acts 8:37. This will give me a chance to drink my tea. Does anybody have Acts 8:37 handy?
There doesn't seem to be an Acts 38:37. It goes from 36 to 38.
Ooh, the plot thickens. Does anyone have a 37? All right. So most modern translations don't have Acts 8:37. If you have it, chances are you're working from an older version of the Bible, one that relies more on what we call the received text. And if you don't have an 8:37, chances are you're working from a fairly modern translation, one that really values text criticism. So the deal with 8:37 is that scholars have just sort of decided that it was a later edition. And sometimes when things are a later edition, they keep it in and they put a little asterisk next to it. And sometimes they leave it out. And in this case, it has been left out for the most part. What 8:37 does is it's sort of a liturgical moment where there's sort of this, let's see if I can find it. I should have written it down. There's this liturgical moment where Philip asks something to the eunuch, and then the eunuch kind of gets to make a response. And if you believe with all your heart, Philip says, you may, that is, be baptized. And he, that is the eunuch, replied, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So it's interesting, you know, just to point out that most of us have never noticed that there's not an 8:37. We probably never would have noticed. And just to point out how much work your Bible is already kind of doing for you in terms of interpreting the text for you before you even get to it. But it's also kind of worth pointing out, you know, there's a recent article out from a scholar who's at, I think, Yale, Yijan Lin, who just points out that without 8:37, there's no direct recording of a teaching, an affirmation, or invitation from Philip. It kind of says, then Philip taught him, but there's nothing in the text that does that. And so that might have been why a later scribe added it in to kind of make that explicit. And there's also no chance for the eunuch to kind of make a profession of faith. And so that might have been why it was added in. So that's kind of the positive reading of 8:37. The negative reading of it might be that because of this person's multiple swirling identities in the text, that a scribe felt suspicious enough of the eunuch that there needed to be this sort of explicit, yes, I believe with all my heart kind of statement. And that's what makes this baptism okay. But it's just one of those little curiosities, I think, of how biblical kind of stuff works. So in the next chapter after this, we get one of the most prominent stories in the book of Acts. In fact, it's prominent not only because it's really important as a pivotal plot point, but also because it's told 3 different times in the book of Acts. And that is the so-called, I'll make my little air quotes, so-called conversion of Paul. It's always called a conversion. It's not actually a conversion, I don't think. It's a call narrative. It mirrors call narratives from the Hebrew Bible when prophets are called by God. The same kind of stuff happens here as happens there, but we call it a conversion. It's my colleague Pamela Eisenbaum, who I'm sure has visited with you all many times, wrote a book maybe 10 or 12 years ago called Paul Was Not a Christian. She hates that title, by the way. Publishers usually choose your title. You don't get to choose your own title, but I think it's really apt because Paul was not a Christian. Paul was a Jew, and there was no Christianity to convert to at that point. There's really not an institution to change over to. They're still all Jews in one sense or another at this point in the book of Acts. So he's not converting, he's receiving a call. And he receives this call on the road to Damascus, and he's on his way, his name is still Saul, I should say. Saul is on his way to persecute these followers of Jesus. And he sees a light and he hears a voice and he asks, who is it? And he's told this is Jesus. And it's important to note, here that these three tellings of this story in Acts are all somewhat in conflict with Paul's own telling of this story in Galatians. That it seems like, there's different versions of this story out there, and Paul kind of reacts angrily to the version that sounds something kind of like what Acts is doing here. So I think even as we're reading these stories from Acts, we should acknowledge that Paul might have had a different take on it. But he goes on to Damascus, and he meets Ananias, who is skeptical of Saul, as you might imagine he would be, because he until recently was trying to kill followers of Jesus. And but a vision convinces Ananias, and Saul gets introduced to kind of the larger community of followers of Jesus who are also skeptical. His sight gets restored. And so this is kind of the call narrative of Saul. So on the name, Saul and Paul, I think one of the things I always kind of grew up hearing is, well, his name changes from Saul to Paul because it signifies that he's converted. He's become a Christian, so his name can't be Saul anymore. He's going to be called Paul from now on. If that's the case, then Acts doesn't really do much with it. Paul, by the way, never mentions it, but Acts even kind of just offhandedly says in 13:9, but Saul, also known as Paul, looked on intently. Like, that's all you get is, oh, these are his two names. So it's not really played up as a dramatic signifier of some new converted identity. It's really just a kind of a name that gets slid into in certain kinds of ways. Most likely of this, I think the most likely explanation actually is one that's been put forward recently by scholars, especially scholars of color or scholars who have immigrated to the United States from somewhere else, which is just to point out that a basic strategy of trying to make yourself understood to people who don't know how to understand you is to change your name. So I have a colleague here at the Iliff School of Theology you've probably met before, Professor Miguel de la Torre. And Miguel de la Torre went by the name Mike for a long time because it was a way to make himself seem less strange to the people who didn't want to put in the effort to understand what Miguel might mean. And you probably have met other people who have done this. But Barack Obama went by Barry for a long time, still does to a lot of his closest friends, because Barack is, comes with baggage. So I think that's probably what Saul is doing here. Saul is the name of an Israelite king, and it, therefore carried a lot of solemn weight with it. I think when he's talking to other Israelites, people would have known who Saul was. But as soon as you get out of that part of the world, it starts to sound weird. It starts to sound like you're from somewhere else. It starts to single you out as strange. And so as soon as he gets to Gentile areas is when this change occurs. He starts going by Paul, which is a very common name, very common Roman name. And it would have made him seem less scary. It's just a way to disarm, right, the people he's coming into contact with, which is a strategy that people still use today. So I think that's what's going on there. Speaking of coming into contact with Gentiles, in chapter 10, there's this fascinating story of a Roman military official named Cornelius who has a vision, and it tells him to send for Peter. And as the messengers are going to tell Peter, he's having a vision. And in the vision, this sheet full of animals is coming down from heaven. So Peter goes to Cornelius, and he kind of notes that while he's always known not to associate with Gentiles, this vision has told him that it's actually okay. He should not call anything profane or unclean. So this kind of becomes the justification for a mission to the Gentiles. the book of Acts puts this not in Paul's hands, and in Paul's letters, he's pretty clear, I'm the one who thought of this. But in Acts, it's Peter who kind of gets the first clue that this might be okay, that Gentiles might be okay. But it sets up a conflict later that we'll get to, especially next week. And the conflict is, that because of this vision, Peter comes to understand in powerful ways that Gentiles are okay. And he kind of convinces the other Jerusalem church people, these are people like James, that it's going to be okay for Gentiles to be in community with them. And they even, they have a sort of a conference about it. They have a meeting where they decide that it's going to be okay. And then there's later on some incident that makes that in Paul's mind means that Peter has gone back on his word. And so this erupts into a series of conflicts. And there are big competing theories about this. Some scholars think that Acts 11 is what's describing the thing that's happening in Galatians 2, and others think it's Acts 15 that's describing what's happening in Galatians 2. I'm kind of an Acts 15 person, but ultimately, either way, it seems like some people decided, yes, Gentiles can be with us, but they're going to have to be circumcised and they're going to have to keep the Jewish law. And this just made Paul irate. And so they had this conflict over that, which, as we'll see next week, really led to a breach between Paul and people like James and Peter that was never healed. And not only that, but a breach between Paul and his church in Antioch. And that's the next slide is the church in Antioch. But after this point, Paul is sort of adrift. He doesn't really answer to anybody in the book of Acts in certain kinds of ways. So, and this helps to make sense, of books like Galatians and 2 Corinthians, where Paul is just angry. If you go and read these books, he's angry that people have come along behind him in these places and have started to say, no, you need to convert, well, that's the wrong way to put it. You need to get circumcised. You need to become fully Jewish before you can be a Jesus follower. And for Paul, I think we don't often think about, we think about circumcision in the abstract, but circumcision is not abstract if you are an adult person trying to convert to Judaism, because it's a surgery, right, to be circumcised. And you have to think about what surgery like that would have meant in a time before antiseptics and anesthesia, and it's quite a barrier. So, and it also, by the way, genders belonging. If you have to be circumcised to become a follower of Jesus, then that leaves some people out, right, who cannot go be circumcised. So I think all that's kind of in play here in this conflict that we see being set up in this part of Acts. But we won't end this part of the discussion on conflict. We'll end it on a chord. We'll end it on a happy note, which is that in chapter 11, when they get to Antioch, and this is Antioch in Syria, so it's not too far from Judea and from Jerusalem, there's this kind of second birth of idyllic community, the second utopia in the church in Antioch that is portrayed as very peaceful and in fact very overflowing with the Spirit. That the church in Antioch seems to have been especially good at giving birth to expressions of the Spirit. And it's this church in Antioch that Paul joins and is a part of for about a year. It's this church in Antioch that ultimately commissions Paul and others as missionaries and sends them out. And it's this church in Antioch that ultimately hosts the meal where Peter decides not to eat with Gentiles, making Paul angry and resulting in a split between Paul and the Jerusalem church. So we'll get to all that next week. And for now, I'm going to stop my sharing, if I can figure out how to do it. And we can stop share. We can go back to a conversation, a discussion, now that I've put you all to sleep on this dark and warm night.
Oh, that's interesting.
Reverend Martz.
Thank you, Eric. How was the Ethiopian eunuch story treated in the early Christian community after people knew about it or had read Acts. You answered part of that in your reference to Acts 8:37, which may have been a way of softening. I mean, it sounds like an explosive story to me.
Yeah, I think so. It would have taken just another line or two from the author of Acts to really explain what the story means, one way or the other, right? But that line never comes, or maybe it comes in 8:37, but not until too late. That's an interesting question. You know, the reception of the eunuch, how the story is received by people. I think scholarship, like older scholarship, not even scholarship, but older sort of commentary by people in the tradition, often focused on just that aspect of his foreignness, right? That this is a person from elsewhere, not within the confines of the Roman Empire, and therefore this symbolizes the success of the movement, that it's being conveyed, you know, even to the edges of the world, as Jesus promised that it would. And in fact, there is a very early and very flourishing Christian tradition in Ethiopia that often gets left out of, you know, Mediterranean-centered narratives about how Christianity got its start. Somewhere behind me, there's a book. There's this great new illustrated gospel book, or two of them actually, that have been uncovered from some church library in Ethiopia that date to older than any of the illustrated gospel books that are that are known from the Mediterranean. So there's this early Jesus tradition in Ethiopia, and I think a lot of the older, you know, medieval and older church commentators saw it that way. I think it's only with, you know, the centering of Christianity in Europe in this kind of colonial period where people started to say, well, maybe this person isn't really, you know, what the text says they are. Maybe this Ethiopian eunuch is not really black, not really a eunuch. There's people who argue that eunuch here, you know, is a role, not a physical condition, right? So I think there's a lot of denial and a lot of kind of normalizing the eunuch that goes on in Eurocentric scholarship.
But
There's so much. Yeah, go ahead.
He was an outsider on, as you've well pointed out, several levels.
Yeah, that's how I read the text. I think its most basic reading is, here's a story about an outsider on many dimensions who becomes an insider through sheer force of enthusiasm, and who, you know, makes water appear in a desert out of sheer desire to be baptized. And to me, the meaning is pretty clear, right? Like, this is the person who's supposed to stand in for the ends of the earth. And other people, by the way, point out that one of the reasons there might be resistance to the Ethiopian really being Ethiopian is that if they are Ethiopian, then they become the first Gentile convert. And that takes the honor away from Cornelius, who was in Caesarea, but was actually a Roman soldier, so from Italy probably. And so, you know, the first Gentile convert isn't an Italian, but it's a Ethiopian, and people just can't with that. And so they find ways to deny the Ethiopian's identity. Told you religion and racism are linked. Other thoughts, other questions, comments? I taught a class, by the way, while you're thinking, last fall here at Iliff, called Queering Early Christianity, which is just a look at the New Testament and the early Christian tradition through the lens of queer theory, which is this fascinating, I told you I was a theory editor, this fascinating collection of theory. And the class overloaded. Like, there were more students who wanted to take it than there were spots, because there's so much interest in this. But the story that collected the most interest from among those students, there were two. One was the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, and the other is the raising of Lazarus. These are the two places where students who are interested in querying early Christianity really zeroed in on. And I don't think that's accidental. Have I lulled you to sleep?
No, I may be naive, but I always accepted that the Ethiopian eunuch started the Ethiopian church. And it is so different and so unique. And those pieces of Christianity and the Egyptian part of the church, they're not quite like the Middle East. So I don't know.
That's not naive at all. In fact, I think that's how the Acts works. I think that's how the author of Acts worked, is he had some knowledge of something that was true. There's a strong community of Jesus followers in Ethiopia, and he finds a way to get the connection made. And so maybe there was, a tradition of this Ethiopian eunuch, or maybe it's an invention of the author of Luke, which again sounds like I'm denigrating that person, but I'm not. I think it's very possible that the Ethiopian eunuch is in Acts because the author of Acts knew there was this strong tradition and needed to find a way to get it there, right? And there is like this vibrant tradition that is not, as you're pointing out, like isn't as tied to the politics of the Roman Church. So if we zoom forward 200 or 300 years, there's this moment, right, where there's a theological bottleneck, and there's this great diversity of early Christianity, and then there's the Council of Nicaea, and Constantine's sitting there, he's the emperor, and he says, y'all are going to figure this out. We all need to be on the same page. So they get on the same page. And what happens in that bottleneck is you lose a lot of that diversity. But the Ethiopian church, and as you're saying, the Egyptian church and the Syrian church in some ways, were not under that same Roman authority in the same kind of ways. And so they preserve some of that diversity that wouldn't have otherwise been preserved, or didn't get preserved in what sometimes is called the proto-Orthodox tradition that comes through the Council of Nicaea. So it's in some ways like, in genetics, where there's a population, and my favorite example is the woolly mammoth, where there's woolly mammoths all over the place, and then there's a little population of them that get stuck on an island off California. And after time, those populations, the one on the island and the one on the mainland, lose touch with each other, and the one on the mainland actually dies off. And there's woolly mammoths on this island off of California until the pyramids are being built. Like, they lasted a long time, these woolly mammoths. And I think that's kind of how these, non-Roman diverse Christianities is they are out there on this island evolving independently in certain kinds of ways, not under the same pressures that you see in places like, Alexandria or Ephesus or Corinth. And so they can preserve some sort of older tradition that's really, really valuable for us to pay attention to. Most of us come to Christianity from these very proto-Orthodox and Orthodox, pathways. We're all, I think, I'm maybe generalizing, but I think we're all mainline Protestants more or less here. And that's sort of how we come to it. But there's other ways to be Christian that are out there. And I think you're not naive for noticing that at all.
Eric, one of the recollections I have from probably my very first trip to Jerusalem and being in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it seems like we were wandering around. I mean, a lot of back staircases and so on, but somewhere either there or in an adjoining building, there's a chapel that's an Ethiopian chapel in honor of, or memory of, or acknowledging, Harvey says it's an active church, the Ethiopian Christians. And I remember just being amazed that Ethiopia would have a chapel there, or there would be a church that was uniquely Ethiopian, a congregation, I guess would be what you would call a community. But it was just, going back to those ancient times was just fascinating to me. And so I tie that in with your statement about there was a very strong presence of Jesus followers of the way.
in Ethiopia.
Hmm. I've never been to Jerusalem actually, so I don't know the one you're talking about, but that sounds, that sounds right to me, that there would be a presence. And there's also in Israel a strong Ethiopian Jewish community, that there's an old tradition of Ethiopian Jews. And for a long time in Israel's discourse, sort of domestic discourse, there's this question about whether they get the right of repatriation that other Jews from elsewhere get, and ultimately they do. And so there are, Black Jews, there are Ethiopian Jews in Israel who have, become Israelis by nationality at this point. So yeah, that all sounds right to me. And I think, as I was saying earlier, in some ways it's only in sort of the Protestant Euro-centered imagination that this is surprising. Because we come through a different bottleneck of, the Protestant Reformation and people like Luther and Calvin, and it's all very white over there. And I think we sometimes are surprised that there might be other people in this same tradition as us. And there's, textual evidence for that, I think. So next, if I get to Jerusalem, I will have to go to that chapel and check it out.
You can't avoid it if you go in to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from the top level.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty big. It's called the Kedan Meharat Church. They're Ethiopian Orthodox. It's interesting because if you go to Bethlehem in the Church of the Holy Nativity, the Greeks don't let them in there because we were there on Christmas Eve, January 6th, and the Copts were relegated to the courtyard outside for their worship on Christmas Eve because the Greek patriarch wouldn't let them into the Holy Nativity to do anything. So, but yeah, no, it's a big dome. It's a massive, it's really a monastery actually that's attached to the sepulcher. So it's pretty cool.
That sounds amazing. I do travel trips. I've heard some of you talking last week about trips you've taken over the years, and that's always on my list, and it's never quite the right time to do the Holy Land. We're doing Italy this fall if we can travel, but I'll put that on my list for sure.
Yeah, I think the best time to go over there is during the Orthodox celebration. So like if you go there, if you can be there for Orthodox Christmas Eve and be in Bethlehem and see all that, it's really amazing to watch it. And the Copts are all over Bethlehem. I mean, since they can't get into the Church of the Nativity, they hold services all over the place, like in the street. But about January 4th, they start massing in Bethlehem, and there's just hundreds and hundreds of Coptic Christians that make their way in there. It's just pretty spectacular.
I reached over and grabbed this book that I was talking about. This is these are some of the illustrations from that book that's only recently rediscovered. These are canon tables, but they're maybe not great photographs because they wouldn't allow the book to be taken out of the country, which is a good call in my opinion. But you can see some of the, these are probably 3rd, maybe early 4th century text and illustrations, which predate the other illustrated manuscripts that we know about by 2 or 3 centuries at least. They're called the Garima Gospels, Garima, if you want to go look them up. What other conversations do we want to have?
When I went to Israel and in the city of Jerusalem, I was really surprised that it was 3 different sections. It was the Jewish, the Christian, and the Armenian. And I wondered how they got in there. I mean, they're Christian, but how Jerusalem got, those 3 areas.
That's a good question that I don't actually know the answer to. I bet somebody here does, where the Armenian quarter comes from. My hunch is it has to do with the British Empire somehow, but I don't know that for sure.
I just thought that was so strange.
Somebody Google it while we're here and we'll figure it out.
I've always wondered about the conflict between Paul and Peter. Was it just literally on how to, join this new group, or was there some other deep-seated conflict that I don't know about?
Mm-hmm. I think actually it's a conflict between Paul and James, and Peter is the battlefield in certain kinds of ways. So it seems like, and this goes back to that Hellenist Hebrew divide, right? Where Paul is a diaspora Jew who grew up somewhere else, speaks Greek really well, can do some Hebrew, but that's not his first language. And then there's, people like James who were in the boat with Jesus, and maybe come from Galilee or something like that, and were sort of more belonged to the land. And what this turns into is sort of these two factions that are represented by James on the one side and Paul on the other. So you've got the James faction, which thinks to be Jewish or to be Judean is to worship at the temple, to keep the Jewish law, to keep the commandments as God put them forth, to be a part of the covenant that God has made with Israel. That's what it means. Then you've got Paul and others like him who come from the diaspora who have had to negotiate that identity quite a lot more. And they don't grow up going to the temple all the time. It's a special thing to go to the temple. And you can't always keep the Jewish law in every little way when you live in a city that's far away, because there's not as many ways to do it. It's just harder to do. And so there's people who've had to accommodate, and there's people who have never had to accommodate, and they come into conflict over this question of Gentile belonging, where James's people are saying, no, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, Jesus was Jewish, you better be Jewish. And people like Paul are saying, look, we've been Jewish in the diaspora without keeping the law completely, or without, and by the way, our synagogues are full of people who are not Jewish at all, but are just really drawn to our community and to the teachings of the God of Israel. Sometimes if you follow inscriptions in synagogues from ancient, Mediterranean regions, sometimes as many as 50% of the people who donate to building projects, which is where you get inscriptions from, are not Jewish. They're theosabastoi in Greek. They're God-fearers. That means Gentiles who didn't take that final step of getting circumcised, but they hung out, and they were part of the community and donated to the building and things like that. So people like Paul understand that dynamic out in the diaspora. And so what Peter does is, there's this vision that Peter has where he decides, okay, it's fine, Gentiles can come in. And then Peter has James in his ear saying, you better not eat with them. And so they have this meal, and he withdraws rather than eating with Gentiles. And Paul's just like incensed by this. He thinks this is just there's no guts behind it. He thinks it's just a scandal. And what Peter's trying to do is please both sides, because he probably hears, yeah, you're right, we should keep the law, and yeah, you're right, we should find a way to include Gentiles. And everyone just views him as wishy-washy. So I think that's ultimately the conflict. And it's also, knowing what I think I know about human nature, I think Paul is a forceful personality. And it seems like wherever Paul went, I say this in the end of my most recent book, wherever Paul went, someone tries to beat him up and chase him out of town. I think he's brilliant. I also think he's impossible. He's the worst. He's the best, but he's also the worst. And so I have a sense that he would have been a hard guy to get along with. And someone like James, who could sit there and say, look, who are you, Paul? Like, we don't even know who you are. I used to have fish on the beach with this guy, Jesus. I was there when he got crucified, and you're going to come tell me what it really means to follow Jesus. So I think, there's probably, beyond the question of circumcision and keeping the law, there's just a clash of authority, and they both want to be the boss, and they both want to be the important figure. That's my guess. That's all reading between the lines a lot. who knows?
So
But there's a lot of energy in the New Testament for that. Sorry, Jerry.
No, I was going to say, so I have an answer for your Armenian quarter.
Yeah.
No, it's
Was it the
interesting.
British?
No, in the 4th century, actually, the Armenians were the first ones to declare Christianity a state religion. And when they did that, there was a large group of Armenians that settled in Jerusalem. And around the 5th century, there's writings that talk about them. And so that's where they come from. They started building monasteries. St. James was one of them around the 5th, 6th century. And really the Armenian quarter is kind of part of the Christian quarter. You know what I mean? It's kind of included over there. They're just a little small subsection, but the Armenians are cool because they're interesting because in 451, they separated themselves from most of the church because they rejected this idea of a dual nature in Christ, and they were called Monophysites. And if you go over there today, they're still referred to that way. Like they call them Monophysites if you talk to like other Christians. And they're persecuted pretty bad for that, actually, over the years. But yeah, they've been there a long, long time. And I know in the sepulcher, if you go in there, that the Armenians actually get to go in like before the Romans do. So first the Greek go in, and then they come out, and then the Armenians go in, and then the Romans come over and they go in. So it's pretty cool.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Again, that might be an example of, you know, a place outside the Roman Empire where the sort of homogenizing force of the Council of Nicaea never made it, right? So they can still be monophysites because they never had to sit through Nicaea, which is interesting. Harvey, I see you're unmuted.
Would you explain what a monophysite is?
Yeah, so in the 4th century, there's this huge debate called the Christological controversies. And all that means is they're just arguing over, is Jesus God? And if so, how so? And so you have on the one side this question of the main person is Arius. And so Arius, his famous little slogan was, there was a time when the sun was not, which is bad grammar. But basically he means Jesus is a created being. And on the other side, you've got people who said there was not a time when the sun was not. These are people like Alexander of Alexandria and Athanasius. And they say, you know, Jesus is co-eternal, that he's always been God, sort of the prologue of John kind of figure. And so ultimately the Council of Nicaea said, well, he's both. He's human, but he's also divine. And that's where modern, you know, notions of at least Protestant notions of Jesus's nature come from. But what I'm hearing from Jerry is that in Armenia, they never had that talk. And so in Armenia, they're denying the two natures of Christ and saying he's not both human and divine fully at the same time in this Nicene kind of way, but he's one. And actually, Jerry, is he divine? He's divine, probably.
Yeah, he's just one essence, one everything. That's how I understand the Greek word monophysite, right? It's just one. And I mean, they tried to iron this out. I mean, they ironed it out in 325, and then they affirmed it. But then in 451, they had the Calcidian Council, and that's where they really affirmed it. And they put these two creeds together, and that's when the Armenians said, "We're done." Like they were at that council, but they said, "No, we're not going to do this." And that's when they separated themselves from the rest of the known world. So.
Yeah, and you know, even north of the Roman Empire and like the Germanic areas, there's these Germanic tribes that are kind of they get the fall of the Roman Empire hung around their neck, and they're called barbarians, right? But they were Christians actually, which doesn't usually get told, but they were Arian Christians, so they were the wrong kind of Christian. So sometimes theology or Christology, you know, already by that time becomes a marker of your inclusion or not. And it sounds like, I don't actually know much about the Armenians. I'm learning a lot tonight, but it sounds like they were just on the wrong side of those calculations of who belongs and who doesn't. And it got really, I think once Christianity got hitched with the Roman Empire, suddenly differences of opinion in theology and Christology were no longer all that welcome. They had been sort of tolerated up to that point, but when you're the operating system of the Roman Empire, you got to get your stuff together. And if you're not on the same page, you gotta go. I always have my students act out the Council of Nicaea. I give them parts and have them research their part, and they get in these big fights. St. Nicholas, by the way, Santa Claus, St. Nicholas is famous for punching a guy at the Council of Nicaea. So next Christmas, you can tell that story to your grandkids. Punch somebody.
And it comes up with really great memes too for Facebook, right?
Yes, it does.
Like I'm here to give kids presents and punch heretics. So.
And I'm all out of presents.
I'm all out of presents.
See, it's amazing where the book of Acts will lead you, right? Because it is sort of this blueprint, right? Like where it's thinking about what it means to be a community and a movement in certain kinds of ways. Hearing somebody's. I don't know who that is. Yes, Harvey.
Before we stop, I want to put in a commercial for your book, but I don't want to preempt what you're going to do to wind up things. You or Jill or Jerry.
Give me all the commercials you want to give me.
I ordered Eric's book from Amazon, Paul the Progressive, with a question mark, and began, which I often do with books, in the last few pages where the summary is. My understanding of Eric's well-founded argument is that when you don't consider the pseudo-Pauline letters, the letters that were attributed to Paul, but not actually authored by him, he comes off as a pretty open-minded, by and large, believer and advocate of sexual equality. We would talk about that if we were looking at 1 Corinthians 6 or 7, I think. You've got I started next with the chapter on Paul the homophobe, which deconstructs some of the clobber verses attributed to Paul. I'm doing a webinar in 3 weeks for our United Methodist group of retired pastors on the clobber verses. And Paul's context really needs to be understood before you take those verses literally. Paul the misogynist, he didn't write some of those things that are attributed to him. And even in 1 Corinthians 14, the 2 or 3 verses there are probably inserts by somebody who was copying that text and was so uncomfortable with the equal notions Paul had about women that he tried to correct those. Anyway, this is a really accessible, readable volume, and I was just delighted at what I've read so far, and I don't expect to be unpleasantly surprised with the rest of it. So I commend Eric's book to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wrote that book for churches just like yours, because that's the kind of churches I have come out of. And everything, the early chapter of that book, the first chapter, I say, at Iliff and then also in churches, what I hear all the time is, I hate Paul. And I understand, why we would feel that way. But I think, if you read Paul through some of the new lenses that are coming along, and if you read Paul with an understanding of what he did and did not write within the New Testament, he actually comes across a little bit better. And he's still not, without his problems, and neither am I, but I think he becomes a lot more of an ally, which is part of the subtitle. He's an ally for inclusion and justice in certain kinds of ways that he's not in traditional progressive Christian imaginations.
I haven't gotten far enough to know what you do with Philemon, but we hear in Colossians and Ephesians the writer rehearsing the code of ethics that was common for that time, slaves obey your masters. And in Philemon, he sends back an escaped slave who could be executed by Roman law, but says to the owner, sends back Onesimus, who is the slave, to Philemon, and says, treat him as a brother. I think that's pretty radical.
Yeah, I think I wish Paul would have had enough imagination to say to Philemon, slavery is wrong, but that's not what he says. And instead, I think he intervenes in the best way he knew how in his time and place. And he intervenes on behalf of this one person. And you know, that's maybe not what we would hope he would have done, but it's not nothing. You know, and a lot of the stuff he's a lot of the words put in his mouth in places like Colossians and Ephesians and 1 Timothy are not things that Paul wrote himself, as you were saying.
Yeah, I had to read a really great book that kind of opened my eyes to Paul a little bit. It was called it's called A Feminist Introduction to Paul by Dr. Sandra Hack-Pawlowski. And she kind of refutes this idea, you know, that Paul's this anti-feminist, you know, anti-woman kind of person, that's kind of an incorrect way to interpret what he's writing. But it's a really short book, but it's really, really insightful. It really helped me a lot when I was in seminary.
Yeah, that's a really good book. Yeah. There's a whole reconsideration of Paul going on in biblical scholarship that I don't think it's quite made its way to the pews yet, but it's super exciting, I think, and it makes Paul less obnoxious than he might otherwise be. He's still, if you started with the last chapter, I still say in the last chapter, I think he's impossible to get along with. I think he's actually tried to get the publisher to let me call this book Paul Was Not an Asshole, and they wouldn't let me, but he is a little bit, just a little. I was going to use that as an homage to Pam Eisenbaum's book, Paul Is Not a Christian, but he's a complicated guy, but I think modern biblical scholarship is helping us a little bit think about him. So I appreciate the engagement with the book. It was available for like $5 on Kindle as recently as a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if it still is or not. You can get it cheap. Well, so I think we're probably getting close to our time. Just as a preview for next week, we're going to be looking at starting with chapter 13 and going through chapter 20, which is basically all the story that's left in Acts up to the point where Paul really gets himself into trouble. So it's a lot of really fascinating, travel narratives, lots of adventures, lots of new cities, and it's in some ways I think the most exciting of these 4 weeks is week 3. So we will be getting back together again next week with our who knows what kind of weather, and I'm looking forward to being with you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And we'll look forward to an exciting third week next week. Thank you all. Good night.
Night.
Thank you.